with Miss Julie. And for those of you who are joining us online, we want to say welcome this morning. Again, a welcome to those who are here joining us, whether this is your first time or whether this is your church home. We're glad you're here. We are getting started this week. Not getting started. We're picking up where we left off. We started last week a sermon series called Better, and this is week 2 of Better. And last week we talked about it being better is one day in God's presence. How one day in God's presence really changes who we are. When we make it a habit, it fully changes who we are, and we find ourselves living in the fullness of God. And this week, the sermon title is Better is One Handful. As a kid, I remember trick-or-treating. Anybody remember trick-or-treating as a kid? It was one of my favorite things to do up until about 3rd grade. And the story that I'm about to tell you will explain why all of a sudden it wasn't my favorite thing to do anymore. I had gotten a haul of candy. A haul of candy. And I remember my dad saying, listen, don't eat it all. And so we came home and he said, you can eat some candy, but he let me make the choices. Anybody ever eat Spree's candy when you were a kid? Spree's are like little, like sweet tarty things. They were one of my favorites. Notice I said were. So I separated out. Anybody remember separating out the candy and trying to make decisions about, so I had my chocolates, and then I had the ones that nobody wanted, the little tiny wrapped ones, Smarties, I think is what they were called, that taste like chalk. I imagine it tastes like chalk. I never tried chalk, but they reminded me of chalk. And I had those, and those were like the last resort, right? That was when everything else was gone and you had nothing left until Easter. Those were going to, make their way into the drawer, and you I want some candy, and I'm out of the good stuff. I had that pile going. And I had my Starburst pile because I loved Starburst as a kid. And then I had my Sprees. And I remember my dad said, hey, just a handful. Just a handful. So I took my candy to my room and I proceeded to eat every Spree that there was, because he was right in that I probably should have just eaten a little, right? And he was right that I wanted to keep, my fancy stuff, the chocolate bars. I loved going to those houses that would give you the full-size Snicker bar. And I had a few of those, and I was going to stuff those away. But the Sprees for some reason, Sprees must have been on sale that year. And I had, just gobs of Sprees. And for the next hour, I proceeded to eat what seemed like my weight in Sprees. And I remember at the time they were so good. And it wasn't long, and my dad said, hey, it's time to come downstairs. We were going to eat something right quick, and then it was going to be off to bed. And I remember I came downstairs, and there must have been some curious look to my face, because my dad said, are you okay? I said, uh-huh. And he sat something in front of me to eat, and I wasn't okay. He said, you look kind of green. Are you sure you're okay? And I proceeded to have a Spree fountain all over myself. And then I proceeded to make my way to the bathtub because I was covered in Sprees already eaten. And my dad said, you ate all of them, didn't you? Oh, he knew. And I kind of felt ashamed. I'd eaten every Spree I had, and it was obvious. I said to myself, if one is good, more must be better, right? And I would say to you that we do this as adults. If one is good, certainly more must be better. A few bucks in the bank is a good thing, right? It keeps Murphy from coming and sweeping up everything. But more money must be better than just a few bucks, right? More stuff. My goodness, we like our stuff, our things. More stuff must be better. And we live in an age where, dare I say, that we think if we pack our bag of life with more activities, it must be better, right? And we find ourselves going, well, I just can't make it to church. I just can't make it to that thing. I've got to get the things in. More. Adam and Eve were in the garden where they had all the food they could possibly want. And yet the serpent was able to say to them, but there's this one thing. Can't you just try the one thing? Just one more. And he sold them a lie that one more would always be better, and they bought it. He's still selling us that lie. He sells us the lie that what we don't have must be the one thing we really, really need. And we buy it. We buy it hook, line, and sinker. Marketers know this, so we turn on the television. You can't even turn on YouTube without there being an advertisement for something you just gotta have, right? I tell my daughter, we started this at a young age because we would watch cartoons, and of course, cartoons always have commercials for toys, right? And so we started the conversation with her early when she said, Daddy, I just got to have that. I got to have that. I got to have the thing. Dad, you got to check that out. Say, honey, what are they trying to sell you? What do you mean sell? Well, how many toys do you have? I've got lots of toys. Okay. How did you get those toys? They were things I wanted, Dad. They were things you wanted, right? How many of those toys do you play with? Uh-oh. Yeah. What are they trying to sell you? What are they trying to sell you? And so every time I turn on the television and I see a commercial for something new, I go, okay, well, that's neat, you know. We were over with the Maoris yesterday, and he and I were talking about that, and he said his favorite button is the mute button during those, and I agree wholeheartedly. Because the world is trying to sell us that just one more thing is what we need. Just one more thing. And you know what? We buy it on the day in and we buy it on the day out. And here I was, sold on the idea that if I had just one more spree, that one was going to satisfy me. And it did not end the way I anticipated. I think my father would have been happy had I come bounding downstairs, bouncing off the walls with sugar. But instead, it equaled a trip to the bathtub and a trip to the laundry, right? It is better to have less of what doesn't matter and more of what does. Our theme verse for today is Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse 6. It says, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. See, the reality is at some point we've got to be happy with what we have. At some point we've got to learn what it is, as Paul puts it, to therewith be content. whatsoever my circumstance. But the world is selling us this idea that more is better. Bigger is better. But why is one handful of less of what doesn't matter better? Because with that handful of less, you can actually help somebody. You can actually give. You can actually encourage somebody. You might actually have time to take a rest if you put aside what doesn't matter. In Luke chapter 12, verse 15, there's this story, actually in Luke chapter 12 in general, there's this story. It's one of my favorite stories in Scripture. And don't ask me why it's one of my favorite stories in Scripture, other than I think back to a kid's book that my grandmother read me, and I've read it to my kids as well. But it's a story of the rich young fool who wakes up and he has everything. He's got the stuff. And he goes and he admires his buildings that carry his grain. The story goes that the birds land and they light some out and it falls out on the ground, and there's a poor man who tries to take it, and the rich man gets upset because he wants more and more and more. And so he decides he should probably build bigger and better granaries. And so he does this, and he goes through the process, and he's so proud of himself. He's so proud of what he has. And he says to himself, I know one day I'll be an even better person, but for now I'm going to enjoy what I have, and I'm going to continue to grow it. And we're told in that scripture that there's this rich fool who dies that very night. All of his stuff for naught. Being a jerk for naught. Luke 12:15, then Jesus said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." I love this part. A man's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. We have this propensity to think that because we could have more stuff, that somehow defines us. And we have that propensity because, again, we're being sold that, right? And it sure is cool stuff, isn't it? But that's not where your legacy is. That's not what your life should consist of. That's not what people will remember you for. In verse 21, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. You die with nothing. You can't take it with you. There's a story of a guy who is rich, and when he passes, he has it in his will that he wants to take it all with him, all of his money. And so the lawyers are looking at it, and they're like, there's just no way around this. We've got to pack the money into the coffin. And the wife looks at him and says, I've already got it covered. The lawyer says, well, where's it at? She said, I wrote him a check and put it in his pocket. Better to have less of what doesn't matter and more of what does. But in order to get to there, we really have to define what does matter, don't we? And so I've left you a space because here's the thing. I can talk about the things that matter, but what matters to you? And I would challenge you this week to take the time to figure out, in life, what is it that matters? I think we can all agree to some of those things. We would say, you know what, my relationship with God really matters. My family matters a lot. My kids, those matter. Making a difference, that matters to me. Showing God's love, super important. For some of you, your sobriety might matter because you know what you were before and you know what you are since. For me, my church matters. Leaving a godly legacy, that matters. That people see Jesus in me, that matters. That my loved ones know who Jesus is, that matters. I can promise you that not on anybody's list is that their favorite team wins the playoff game, or the leather sofa, or that they have the right car, or that their countertops match their paint, or that the square footage of their house is enough for at least 5 people. If you really look at it, your Twitter followers don't matter. Your Facebook friends. I'm not talking about the real ones that you actually have connection with. I'm talking about the ones who just troll you. The kind of phone that you have, that probably doesn't matter. The score of your favorite video game probably doesn't matter. But yet we fill our lives with some of that stuff, right? You don't understand, I have to work 60 hours a week. Got to pay for the stuff. Not understanding that the handful that we can grab is really small compared to what's available. And we have to be mindful, and we have to begin to sort out. We have to make decisions about what's important versus what really probably isn't. Dave Ramsey talks about some of that stuff. The car should be a point A to point B kind of thing, right? Don't get me wrong, it's really, really nice to have a really nice car. But is it important? Or is just being able to get to and from work? The house, I need a roof over my head. But I don't need 10 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms. Don't get me wrong, I've been in some really nice houses. And they're very, very cool. I can't imagine trying to keep up with them. Don't get me wrong, the little device that you carry around in your pocket, they're nice to have. And there's some fancy things that they can do. But when I was a kid, I remember that there was about an 8-foot distance that I could travel from said thing before I had to go back to the base. And it didn't look up all the things, but I could talk to my grandma. We got to be mindful about what matters. So this begs the question, what does one handful living look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like you taking what matters and making it the priority. You say, but Pastor, how do I get there? We start here. We have to let go of what doesn't matter, right? The writer of Hebrews says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race marked out for us. Throw off everything that hinders. Cut back. Cut back on your spending. It's better to have a little with less fear, isn't it? How about your schedules? Cut back on your schedule. Listen, even in ministry, and I'm guilty here. Where I came from, and I've told you guys this, where I came from, I was working a full-time job, sometimes 68 hours a week. I was working ministry, trying to pour in 20 hours a week. And then my family got the what? The leftovers. And in the last couple of years, I really began to try to make adjustments to that. And so we began to take more vacations, and I began to take vacation days sometimes at the end of the week just so I'd get a little more weekend. Why? Because that little boy and that little girl and that wonderful woman that I married, this week it'll be 21 years ago, they deserve more than my 60 and 80 hours a week at work plus my 20 hours trying to do ministry. When I married my wife, I went through a whole set of vows in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, till death do us part. I married her, not my job. I married her, not my ministry. My first ministry is to my family, because I am responsible for sailing that ship. And I am responsible. I will be held accountable when I stand before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And he says, were you faithful in this endeavor? I do not want to look at him and go, you know what? I just didn't have time for my kids. My legacy stands with them. And so the schedule, that's something that I need to take and maybe cut some ends off of. You say, but you don't understand. I have to work that 60, 80 hours. Well, do you? I know it's hard, and I know that the money is nice, but do you work for them? Or do they own you? That's a question that sometimes we have to ask and we have to arrange. And it may mean if you find yourself in a situation, I'm saying if because I've got a caveat to this. If you find yourself in a situation where you're constantly being asked to work those kinds of hours and you're being threatened with your job if you don't, could it be that you need to take a step back and say, you know what, God, if you've got something else for me, I believe wholeheartedly that this is taking way too much of who I am. Now, my caveat is this. For the vast majority of us, that is not the case at all. It is a choice that we have made where we have built up in our own mind our importance to the organization that we worked for. And we have said, I am so important that they could not possibly live without me for that extra 20 hours a week. Notice I didn't say that's the case for all of us, but it is the case for some of us. And so that begs the question, if you find yourself that you've burned it at both ends of the candle, you've got to find a way to let go of that piece and figure out what really matters. If we're going to let go of what doesn't matter, this means that we have to throw out some things. Oh, my goodness. This is a sore subject. This is our stuff. We're addicted to stuff. How many of you know you're addicted to stuff? Most of us are addicted to the things. I have family members that they have just so much stuff. When we moved, what we discovered is, you know what we had? We had so much stuff. An agreement that we've made with each other since our move is this. Once a year, we're going to go through our stuff and we're going to throw some stuff out. Because if you ever notice that when the next great gadget comes along, there's this propensity to keep the old great gadget because it was just great. And dare I say, if you looked in your cabinets, if you looked in your closets, if you looked in your garages, you would find things that you have not used for a long time, right? I have a friend who, for lack of a better word, is a hoarder. And when you have the conversation about the old TV that's in the garage, well, that's going to have some use for somebody. Well, it's not doing any good in your garage. But it's hard for us because we put sometimes some stock in the stuff. There's some comfort there. I talked about this a few weeks ago, right? Carrying around the baggage. We've got the baggage of stuff. Sometimes we need to take that bag and we need to just toss it out and never think about it again. When my wife and I moved here, there were some boxes down in our basement. Those boxes had been there since we moved into the house 8 years ago. Those boxes had not been opened. Guess what decision we made? Adios Pepe, because if I haven't opened it in 8 years, I probably don't need it, right? So there comes the challenge. Take a look at things. I've got a friend who says you should do it this way. He says, once a year you go through all your stuff and you ask yourself the question, have I used this item in the last 12 to 18 months? If the answer is no, no matter how painful it is, you give it away or sell it. Why? 12 to 18 months is a long time. You probably don't need it. Go through the pain of throwing it out. The third thing to do if you're going to let go of what doesn't matter is this: turn it off. What do you mean, turn it off? Listen, we fill our schedules with so much stuff, and I think I talked about this last week a little bit, but the average one of us that has one of these in this country uses it for 5 hours a day. Between that and television, what could you do with 5 hours a day? Turn it off. The average person who uses one of those, the majority of what they're doing is they're scrolling through Twitter, Faceagram. And they're just scrolling. We took the family this week on Thursday to go hang out with my brother-in-law down at Disney World. There was a ride. I don't do rides the way I used to. As a kid, I could do rides, and it was like, let's go. As an adult, it's like, let's not. I don't want to do that. And they were going to do a spinny ride. Spinny rides are the worst for me. I can't do spinny rides anymore. So I'm like, I'm going to go sit. And as I was sitting there, while they were in line for what was supposed to be 25 minutes, which turned out to be an hour, what did I do? My brother-in-law went with me because he was the same way. He's like, I can't do spinning rides. Please don't spin me around one more time. I will be just like you with the sprees. And so he and I were talking, and he said, man, aren't you glad that it's not like this all the time where you have to sit and scroll? And I thought to myself, he's right. Because I got to be honest, I was bored. Looking at absolutely nothing. Turn it off. Delete apps. Take a Facebook hiatus. Anybody ever done that? I make it a point to do at least 10 weeks at a full time once a year. Plus I'll take days off in between where I'm like, I'm not touching it. I'm not touching it. Why? Because we were walking around the park. Do you know what I saw most of the time was this? In between rides, it's mindless. Like you're there with your family. One of the times I didn't want to ride a ride, my niece didn't want to ride a ride. You know what I didn't do during the time that I was sitting with my niece waiting? This went right in my pocket. Why? Because I was going to eat up the time that I had with her. Put it away. Turn it off. If it's a problem, cancel your subscription. You have enough issues. If we take the time to get intentional about the way that we live life, we'll find that life can be so much richer. But it takes us taking a step back, identifying what is the most important thing, and getting rid of the stuff that doesn't matter. And the second thing that we have to do then is to really fight for what does matter. In Nehemiah chapter 4:14, Nehemiah has assessed this need to begin to build the wall back up. And as he looks around, he looks and he sees the noble people, he sees the average person, and he says these words. He says, remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. Can I just be frank? You know what conversations sometimes I'm finding myself more and more sick of? I am sick and tired of political conversations, especially with Christians. Can I explain why? Fruit. Fruit is why. Because when I look at us as a whole, and church, I'm talking to you, but I'm talking about the church in the United States as a whole, I am sick of looking at our curve and seeing that it's no different than the rest of the world, and then all of us standing together in our churches and going, isn't it terrible? Isn't it terrible? Isn't it terrible? You want to know whose fault it is? Go to your mirror, wipe it down so it's nice and clean, point at it and go, you did this. And then figure out how you're going to be different. And then figure out how you're going to do things differently. Because it doesn't change unless you want it to. Can you believe all the smut I see on the internet? Stop looking at it. Land sakes. Garbage is garbage. Can you believe when I go to the lake and I see all the garbage on the shore, it's not the way it used to be. Take a trash bag with you. Set an example. If every one of us did the things that we hate so much, right, that we turn around and we did the opposite of those things, if we showed up to the springs and we did what God told us to do anyway, which was to subdue the earth, which was to manage the resource, and we set the example, we wouldn't have to complain because the rest of the world would go, yeah, we should probably pick up some of this stuff too. If we would live our lives in the way that we know God desires for us to live our lives, and if we would stand up and we would say, listen, we don't treat people that way, and here's why. And then we actually did that thing and didn't treat people that way, the world would be a different place because we would be a light in a dark place. But what the world doesn't believe is us, because our words and our actions match their words and their actions. Don't believe me? Research says this. Guys, 70% of you, all you out there in TV land as well, 70% of you engage in watching pornography. You say, well, wait a second, that's just everybody in the world. No. Barna did research, and guess what? The church follows the curve. That means 70% of you engage in this. What is that? That is not being faithful to your wife. That is not being faithful to that relationship. And your relationship suffers because of it. You say, well, yeah, it can't be right. Okay, let's try another. This is an old stat, but 54% of marriages end in divorce. Do you want to know what the church's curve looks like? No, I don't, Pastor. Well, guess what I want to share with you. 54% of marriages of Christian couples end in divorce. Do you know why that is? It is because we follow the rest of the world. We're not leading. Shame on us. It is time for us to live in the freedom that we are called to. There's a pastor I know, he says, you know what, I'm weird. You know why I'm weird? Because normal isn't working. People look at my wife and I and they go, you're crazy for homeschooling your children. And I go, call me crazy. I've been called worse. Why? Because I'm choosing to use my life in a different way. Because I don't want my children to have to face some of the things that I see in my students that I've had for 20 years. They're facing questions they shouldn't have to face. That's not appropriate. So I say, you know what? I'm going to educate my child. Disagree with me, it's fine. I'm also not out there going, if you don't homeschool your child, you're a terrible parent. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying I'm making a choice to be different. I choose to turn off the social media. You know what? Sometimes when I watch a movie and I hear one too many curse words, I go, I'm done. Or when it gets to be just a little bit like sickening to me, I go, I'm done. Most of the time when I see that R rating on there, I go, I'm good. And I'm trying to teach my children, listen, You can make choices to do those things, but is it good? Is it pleasing? Does it edify? Then toss that out and fight for what does matter. Church, it's a heart issue is really what it is. We say we're disappointed with the things, but we live just the same way. That's a heart issue. That's on us. We got to get to less of what doesn't matter and more of what does. You have to make a decision that says that your life is too valuable. I've made that decision. My life is too valuable. My calling is too great. And my God is too good for me to waste my life on meaningless things. And so I'm constantly having a conversation and I'm going, God, if there is something in my life that needs to go away, Father, I just pray that you would take that away, or that you would show me and begin to convict me of it. Why? Because out of obedience to what he's calling me to, because I know that my life was this and my life is this because of him, I choose this. This is way better. And when I say I choose that, I mean I choose to follow him all of the days of my life. That means that sometimes I'm going to find myself off path, but I choose to recalculate the route. Feel a little bit like my GPS on these roads out here. My GPS, I pull it out, and I'll try to get around out here, and inevitably it says, entering incomplete map data area. And I'm going, what does that mean? And then it goes recalculating. And it sets me up to go where I'm supposed to go. We got to get to the stage that that's what we're doing in our lives. Listen, you're only going to be the age you are once. Don't miss that. I was lying in a hospital when I had my heart issue, and I wasn't really sure what was going to happen. I wasn't nervous about it. I was convinced that no matter what, God had this. But I did think one thing. Life really is precious. I thought, do I have any regrets? And it really makes you think about the moment, right? Living in the moment, fighting for what does matter, throwing out what doesn't. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. It's a hard issue. And this morning, God may be saying something to somebody. Man, I'm just going to say it. Prioritize and get your priorities right. If you're not happy where you are, talk to God about it. Do something about it. Throw out the trash and fight for what matters. Make your list. This week I challenge you, make your list. What really matters? Talk to your spouse about it. I dare you, you that are married, sit down with your spouse, write out your list individually, come back together, have a conversation about it, and make a decision. Wait a minute, of all this stuff, what's the most important thing? Then take a look at your schedule, take a look at your bank account, take a look at everything in your life and go, are there things that are holding us back from these things? And if those things are there, have a conversation about what it is you're going to do to change that. If you're single, do the same thing, but on your own. The most productive people I know and the most happy people I know, they're very intentional about how they live their lives. They don't have time for nonsense. We got to get that way too. It's a heart issue. We're going to sing a song. It's called Heart of Worship. And the whole idea here is this.